morning, everyone. My name is Brittany Adams. Genetically modified crops have become a field full of misconception and controversy in recent years. Today's speaker is going to clear some of the confusion and talk about ways that these crops could help solve environmental issues in the future. This speaker is a crop and soils major at Virginia Tech, and she furthered her interest in the field by interning in the propagation department of the wholesale nursery, Lancaster Farms. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Ms. Bodie Fletcher.
Thank you, Brittany, for the introduction. Once again, my name is Bodie Fletcher, and today I'm going to be speaking on some of the environmental promises that come along with GMOs. So we've talked about GMOs a lot in this class. I hope by now that you all have a better understanding of how they're made, the different benefits that go along with them. And we've really discussed and focused on the benefits to farmers, higher yield increase, a higher income, and then also feeding the future population and third world countries. But today I want to show you all a different side of it. So I'm going to start with some statistics. So in the 20 years that GMOs have been readily used, pesticide application has decreased by 359,000 tons. And of course this is because they don't have to apply them as readily because of disease resistance and insect resistance. And then also greenhouse gas emissions have decreased by 14.2 million tons. And this is because farmers aren't having to use their machinery as much as they were before because they're not having to spray their crops as often or not having to water their crops as often with drought-resistant varieties. And while these numbers might not seem very large when you think about 20 years in terms of the entire world, only 25 countries have accepted and encouraged the use of GMOs. Change is slow going, but when you think 25 out of almost 200 countries in the world, if we could get every country on board in some form, in some way, think about what those numbers would look like. One environmental issue that is currently being researched is that of phosphate fixation. How many know what phosphate fixation is? Okay. So phosphate or phosphorus is a necessary nutrient for crops, and it's usually applied through fertilizers. And of course that's top-based, so then it goes onto the soil and is absorbed by the plant's roots. The problem is, though, that the plants aren't able to absorb all of the phosphate that is first put down with the fertilizer. And so while the phosphate sits in the soil, it quickly becomes fixated or attached to different minerals and metals in the soil, making it almost impossible for the plant's roots to absorb them later on. So, as the plant needs more phosphorus or phosphate, the farmer adds more fertilizer, and the cycle just continues, and it continues to build up in the soil. And eventually, this soil that has phosphate attached to it is washed into our water supply. And this not only becomes harmful to us potentially if it's not filtered properly, but other living creatures that use, say, the lake or pond, and also the aquatic environment if it's too high of a number. So what researchers are currently doing is they have found and they've identified some genes in crops with roots that are more readily able to extract the phosphate once it becomes fixated to the soil particles. And so what they're working on now is to insert that into other crops, so not only can it absorb the phosphate from the soil before it's washed into the water supplies, but farmers won't have to use fertilizers as often. Another issue that is currently being studied, and this is just a recent revelation for scientists, is that of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. So whether you fully embrace the idea of global warming or not, none of us can argue that temperatures are rising, our climate's changing, we all feel that. I'm sure this summer for everyone was pretty awful, it was for me. And then also we can't argue that burning fossil fuels emits CO2. That's just a fact. So the CO2, of course, is building up in our atmosphere. And what scientists have been studying and following the CO2 curves and seeing where it ends up in our atmosphere. But in recent mathematical calculations, there is 16% of CO2 that they couldn't account for. They didn't know where it was going. They'd calculated how much the oceans were absorbing. They'd calculated the decrease in CO2 emissions with the use of natural resources instead of fossil fuels, but there was still 16% that they couldn't account for. And they finally realized that the plants and vegetation of Earth are absorbing more CO2. They're absorbing more CO2, which means they're photosynthesizing more, which means they're becoming larger, which then means that their leaves can capture more sunlight, produce more photosynthesize, and absorb more CO2. So they are thriving in this high CO2 environment, and they're adapting to it, which I think is just amazing, that nature is able to do this. So what scientists have done is they hope to focus in again on plants that absorb more CO2 so they can take effect or advantage of these natural effects and natural responses to this environmental issue. So again, what they hope to do is insert this gene of absorbing CO2 into crops. So during the growing season, they absorb more CO2, and they hope to place these around city areas where, of course, there is more CO2 emissions from all the cars. And it's really a promising new study, and I could go on and on about this, but I'm going to move on to my last slide for today. And I'm going to end with a quote from Julian Simon. He was an economist in the 1980s, and he was against the idea of the carrying capacity of the Earth, meaning that eventually human population is going to reach a point where Earth can no longer sustain it and level out. And in response to this common theory, he said, "Members of the human race will develop and utilize powers of creativity, ingenuity, and industriousness in their quest to survive." And I believe that GMOs are humans taking advantage of our creativity, of our ingenuity, and being industrious with the knowledge we have of genetics as our technology grows. And really, GMOs are our next step in the quest of survival. So I hope that I've brought a different side to GMOs, focusing more on what we can do as a whole for the world through them. So thank you very much. Are there any questions?